Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Tuesday, May 12th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. After 2 years of litigation, a judge has ruled that the city of Fresno failed to properly include the public in its budget discussions.
The budget negotiation process is definitely different now. However, it's still not open to the public.
Will the ruling change anything? We speak with a Fresnoland reporter to break down this lawsuit and its potential impact on Fresno. But first, these headlines. Advocates in Fresno rallied on Monday in favor of the Fresno County Public Library's effort to provide outreach to the LGBTQ community. Monday's event came in response to a recent Facebook post by Fresno County Supervisor Gary Bredefeld. He called the library's request an effort to, quote, indoctrinate young children regarding the LGBTQ political agenda. Alfred Aldretti is a Fresno activist who supports the library's efforts.
One thing Mr. Bredefeld doesn't understand, it's apparent that inclusion does not mean indoctrination. The Fresno County Library, and all libraries for that matter, are essential and inclusive community hubs that welcome everyone.
The Fresno County Board of Supervisors will vote today on whether to grant funds for the library to take part in the LGBTQ celebration efforts. Governor Gavin Newsom still says he will not weigh in on the race to replace him. That is despite a crowded race for Democratic candidates that has raised concerns about a possible Democratic lockout. Here's Newsom speaking at a press conference late last week.
These are Democratic primaries. There are a lot of people that I've worked with for many, many years. I've made this point again. We can roll back the tape on many different occasions, many different settings. And so that's why. It's just the basis of prior relationships and the respect for, I was there myself.
Newsom says his main focus is making sure a Democrat makes it to the general election, but that he wouldn't do so by making an endorsement. Recent polls show former Attorney General Javier Becerra pulling ahead of other Democrats in the field. Billionaire Tom Steyer and former Congresswoman Katie Porter are shortly behind. Steve Helton is the leading Republican. California, Nevada, and Arizona have reached a 2-year deal to help stabilize the Colorado River. 7 western states that share the water source have not yet reached an agreement on how to prevent Lake Mead levels from falling to critical lows. That's threatening electricity generation at Hoover Dam. The 3 states are committing to significant cutbacks to help prop up Colorado River reservoirs. They include some cuts to agricultural use, which has been an issue, leading to disagreements between states in the river's upper and lower basins. Wildfire prevention treatments are a good investment. A new UC Davis study shows that every dollar spent on prevention saves $3.75 in wildfire damages. Researchers examined preventative treatments and outcomes of nearly 300 fires in the western U.S. They estimate that preventative treatments like forest thinning and prescribed burns prevented billions more in losses. The study was published in the latest issue of Science.
Explore the history of the people and places of our region with KVPR's Central Valley Roots. I'm the host, Joe Moore. Every new episode, I bring you little-known stories of our region. Find the latest episode of Central Valley Roots wherever you get your podcasts, or visit kvpr.org/roots.
And now to our main story. The city of Fresno was just handed a ruling over a case involving California's Brown Act, a law created 73 years ago. It requires local legislative government bodies to meet openly and publicly. But for the last couple of years, the city has been mired in a lawsuit that accused elected officials of breaking the law by making public budget discussions behind closed doors. The lawsuit focused on budget committee meetings that took place out of public view and on the negotiation of the city budget with the mayor's administration. Omar Rashad, with our news partner Fresnoland, first broke the investigation in 2023. He spoke with KVPR's Sarith Hawk to discuss this years-long legal fight and what the recent ruling means for the future of transparency in the city of Fresno.
This case really has been years in the making since you first reported on this in 2023. Can you explain how this turned into a lawsuit since then? Who was behind it all?
Yeah, so in my initial investigation, I quoted several legal experts who were basically saying that under no circumstances should a city council committee be meeting on a regular basis in private. And what happened was 3 months later after our investigation, the First Amendment Coalition and the ACLU of Northern California filed a lawsuit against the city of Fresno, basically saying that the budget committee is in violation of state law. And it's been just about 2.5 years since, and the judge in this case finally issued a ruling last week.
So last week, years after this investigation, the case was finally resolved. Can you explain the court ruling in this lawsuit?
Yeah, absolutely. So Fresno County Superior Court Judge Robert Whalen ruled last week that the city of Fresno was in violation of California law, specifically the annual private budget committee that was convened in 2023 was not following California's Brown Act. And he basically outlined how this annual private committee should have actually been subject to the Brown Act because it was following the characteristics of what's called a standing committee. Essentially, standing committees need to meet in public. Their meetings need to be agendized and released to the public. There also need to be minutes. And so what Judge Whalen found was that this was not being followed, and therefore he issued a ruling that said that city officials violated state law with its budget process.
And despite the ruling that the city violated the Brown Act, the judge decided not to issue an injunction, according to your reporting. Can you explain what an injunction would be in this case? What makes his decision not to issue one significant?
Yeah, so this is very important because it's slightly strange. Judge Whalen in this lawsuit decided against issuing any penalties to city officials. And it's strange because on the one hand, he's saying city officials violated state law, but in the other hand, he didn't issue an injunction that would bar them from doing this in its exact form again. And so basically the ruling reads is the city violated state law, but I'm not going to explicitly tell you to never do this again, which is an interesting outcome. But yeah, nonetheless, he ruled that the city violated state law.
So is there any way to ensure that this law will be upheld in the future? How will the city be held accountable?
Yeah, I mean, if city officials don't follow the Brown Act in the future, it would need to be something that a legal claim is filed over, and it would basically need to go in front of a judge again. And, that is time intensive, resource intensive. This civil case alone took 2.5 years to conclude. And so I guess if city officials decide to open up a private budget committee again in the future on a regular basis, on an annual basis, they would be risking, another lawsuit over this matter, especially if there are, open government groups like the First Amendment Coalition, ACLU of Northern California, who would like to, litigate something like this again.
And I think it's worth noting that this isn't how other major California cities deal with budget issues, right? How does this process maybe to compare to other places like, say, LA or San Francisco? Yeah,
so in our initial investigation, we actually found that Fresno is the only California city out of the state's 10 largest to say that they have a budget committee and it's exempt from the Brown Act. It's definitely not a practice that you see in other cities. And that's actually a detail that was, mentioned in court, that most other cities are not doing this. And there isn't an easy example out of California's even 10 largest cities of someone else doing this like this. And, Fresno's California's 5th largest city. And yeah, no other large city is really doing this.
Okay, so far we've discussed the background of this case, that the city was holding private budget negotiations that turned into a lawsuit, and recently a judge ruled against the city. So I'm curious now, what was the city's response?
Yeah. So it was really interesting. Even though Judge Whalen ruled that the city's private budget committee was illegal under state law, Fresno City Attorney Andrew Jans put out a news release saying that the outcome of the case was actually a victory. He explained that it's because the judge never issued any punitive action against the city that it was a win for the city. And I got this news release last week after the court ruling, and I noticed that nowhere in this news release does it mention that Judge Whalen ruled that city officials violated state law. So it's clear that, City Attorney Andrew Jans is focusing on the second part of the ruling, which definitely needs to be discussed. Like, that can't be left out of the conversation. But it's clear that in his news release, he left out the fact that city officials violated state law. Also in this news release, Councilmember Mike Carbasi called the lawsuit a waste of taxpayer dollars. And to quote, he said, quote, "Instead of fixing potholes and hiring more firefighters to keep Fresno's working families safe, the city has had to waste precious taxpayer dollars defending a nonsense lawsuit," end quote. Councilmember Annalisa Perea also was quoted in that news release saying that this was a deeply unfortunate waste of taxpayer dollars to defend this case. And I think it's just really interesting. This is how, I guess, they're framing a court ruling that said city officials violated state law. And funny enough, I asked both those council members how much it costs defending the city in this lawsuit. Neither of them responded to me. So I think if they're going to say that it's a waste of taxpayer dollars, I think they should be willing to talk about how much in taxpayer dollars was used to defend the city.
So with all that said, what does the budget process look like now? And has that whole system really been overhauled after this lawsuit investigation?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because the budget negotiation process is definitely different now. However, it's still not open to the public. So after the investigation came out in 2023 and after this lawsuit was filed, the Fresno City Council disbanded 11 committees that were meeting privately, one of them being this budget committee. And so instead of, convening a private budget committee to negotiate the budget in private, what happened was in 2024 and also 2025, the mayor would just individually meet with each council member. And so once again, we're sort of still at this point where city officials, even after investigative reporting, even after a lawsuit, are unwilling and not interested in opening up the budget negotiation process for the public to see. And they're making decisions upwards of $70 million at the very least in these budget negotiations. And so I think like the big question is, what do city officials want to keep behind closed doors? What exactly do they want to keep from the public eye? And it's interesting because like after the investigation and the lawsuit, the city changed its process, yet it still was defending itself in court. So I think at the core of this is how city officials spent public money fighting for an illegal process as determined by a judge that they quietly changed, but continue to defend for years after, our investigation and after a lawsuit by open government organizations.
Well, Omar Rashad, government accountability reporter with Fresnoland, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was Fresnoland reporter Omar Rashad speaking with KVPR's Sarith Hawk. And you can read Omar's reporting and other stories from around Fresno at fresnoland.org. And that is today's show. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden, Sarith Hawk, and KVPR, with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
Every day on Up First, NPR's Golden Globe-nominated morning news podcast, we bring you 3 essential stories. At the heart of each story are questions. What really happened? What really mattered? What happens next? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious and to follow the facts. Follow Up First wherever you get your podcasts and start your day knowing what matters and why.